Unfortunately, these tubes of watercolor have been sitting unused for a while, and except for a couple of them, I found several of them hardened and too difficult to squeeze out of the tube. The main challenge is basically getting the pigment out of the tubes, and once you have it in some kind of pans, it's perfectly fine to reuse. You may end up losing some of the smoothness had they been fresh, but they're perfectly fine for learning and certainly better than wasting. So one way to try to salvage the pigment is to cut the tubes open. They're actually not that difficult to do. They're made of a fairly soft metal. I like to create a cut along the base, the side, and the top, creating a flap that can be opened and giving you access to the majority of the pigment fairly easily. I try to scrape out whatever I can into appropriate size trays. The blue and the green pigment had dried out a little more than the others. I added just a little bit of water. If you do decide to use water, it would be preferred to use distilled water or something that is heavily filtered to avoid any impurities or bacteria from spoiling your paint. I'm adding just 2 or 3 drops to help soften the pigment, and then if you leave it for a few minutes, some of that absorbs in and it becomes a little bit more workable. And basically I'm using it just to condense the pigment down into one larger block instead of having small brittle pieces that will be harder to work with, as well as potentially create a mess if any of them fall out of the tray. Fortunately, the pigment and binder had not separated. Mostly it was just dehydrated. So I created a simple still life using a soda can and a pear, starting out with a very light base wash of colors just to establish the size and proportion of the shapes. I like to work across the entire scene if possible. Keep adding more and more color. One of the challenges with watercolor, it's hard to brighten the scene back up. You're using the white of the page for the bright areas. So you want to be fairly certain which areas of the page you want to darken, because otherwise you're going to have to add an opaque pigment if you want to bring back, if you later want to add some brighter pigment on top of dark areas, you're going to have to use something opaque like a gouache instead of watercolor pigments. Both of the objects in the still life are using really warm colors, and for the shadow I'm using the complement, so I'm using a cooler color for the shadow. I'm working predominantly just a few primary colors here, putting down a light wash of cadmium yellow. For the red, this is an alizarin crimson. Instead of mixing the color completely in the palette, I'm just layering on light layers of each as I work. Because the can is a fairly deep orange, I'm adding the alizarin crimson, and I'll come back with more yellow. For the shadows, this is an ultramarine blue. So instead of fussing with details and precision, I'm using large brushes and just trying to get some of the colors right, just trying to loosely capture the main shapes that I see and the colors. For the shadows, I'm using the ultramarine blue one trick that often works is to use the opposite color for the highlight and the shadow. So for example, we have a warm color orange on the can and a yellow on the pear. The opposite of blue is orange. So adding blue to the orange will actually knock down that color and create a nice shadow. And similarly, I'm letting some of this orange from the objects. As I work, I let some of the orange from the objects also land in the shadows. And what that creates is, in real life, most objects that are near each other are going to end up reflecting light onto each other. So if you look carefully, you'll see there's orange reflecting off the can, landing on the pear. There's yellow bouncing off the pear onto the can, and from both objects you're going to have a certain amount of color that lands on the table, from the table onto the object, so everything interacts with each other. Instead of trying to keep perfectly clean separate colors, I like to go ahead and allow some degree of mixing between adjacent objects, and because that's quite often what's happening in real life. So there is going to be some orange and yellow that's landing on the table and among the objects. So basically I'm working back and forth and increasing the contrast, refining the shapes, and just deepening the colors as I go, trying to keep some of the highlights light. And what ends up happening is, because everything is relative, the darker the shadows become, the brighter the objects begin to look. When the objects first start out on a white page, they seem kind of dull. But the more you darken the shadows, the brighter those objects are going to appear. As you mix these primary colors together, the red, the blue, and the yellow, you're going to get a fairly dark color that starts to approach black, starts to approach kind of a muddy black. Here I'm coming in with just a little bit of white gouache to add a few highlights. Ideally, I'd like to do this with a little more precision if I was being careful with this picture, but right now, again, this is meant to just be something quick, loose, and an experiment. Once these dry out, I believe these pigments will hopefully work just fine. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll see you next time. Peace.